Welcome to episode 81 of the Hard Truth About B2B E-commerce. I'm your co-host Isaiah Bollinger, and back with Tim. It's missed a couple of weeks. I've been busy. We had Retail East. Unfortunately, obviously you were sick, but feeling a little better now. So hopefully on the upswing now.
It is good to be back. And for our listeners to just hear the quick version of the story, I went on a trip to Canada with my husband, first big trip actually in a couple of years, and came back and got COVID. And so I'm still recovering from that, but doing well. And my voice may sound a little different today, but maybe soon it'll be back to normal. I do want to continue our tradition and give a couple shout outs. I have a few names of folks who are dedicated listeners I want to say hi to. Jim Crass, who I had not heard from in a long while, who I worked with on a couple startups a few years ago. He's CEO of a company called Edible Garden, and really great guy. He is a listener. So is Stacy Eng, who I also worked with sometime in the past. She is fantastic. Stacy Finkelstein is a professor at a business school at Stony Brook in the MBA program there. And and also Sal Conca. I'm going to be guest lecturing in a marketing class of his coming up soon, also at Stony Brook. And please, folks, just keep reaching out. Just great to hear from listeners. I'm so happy to hear, who's getting something out of our podcast. I want to say something that I think Isaiah has heard before, and I want all our listeners to hear. There are students that are listening to our podcast, which I think is remarkable. So there are now classes that are here that there's this podcast in B2B e-commerce as a resource. And so I think that is fantastic. And students, I hope we don't mess you up. I hope we continue to bring some good guests and bring some good tips here and there. I'm going to briefly pause for our sponsor mentions and then throw it right back to Isaiah to introduce our great guest today.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to give you a word from our sponsors. Our first sponsor is Balance. Balance is a B2B e-commerce payment solution that works well for you and for your buyers. It offers a seamless one-click checkout for almost any payment method, including ACH, wire, checks, cards, even terms. It's used by leaders in B2B e-commerce, and it's as easy as buying a shirt from Amazon. Check them out at getbalance.com. Book a session and tell them what your needs are. They are the first dedicated payment platform for B2B e-commerce, 100% tailored to your needs. Thanks again to our sponsor, Balance. Our next sponsor is TradeCentric. TradeCentric transforms the way businesses transact by enabling punch-out, purchase order, and invoice automation solutions for over 3,000 companies around the world. Uniquely positioned at the intersection of e-commerce and e-procurement, TradeCentric helps B2B buyers connect with suppliers and automate payment, procurement processes to drive greater efficiency and user adoption of streamlined systems. Learn more at tradecentric.com. Thank you to our sponsors.
Okay, that hopefully was enough time to insert those great ads from our sponsors. Thank you to them. Isaiah, where are we? We're episode 81?
Yeah, 81, closing in on 100, and we'll definitely be picking up some volume soon. It's been a busy summer, and hopefully be less busy in terms of missing some of the weeks of recording. But yeah, excited to introduce our guest, Jack Freeman, one of the top people at PeakSpan Capital. I think we've been in touch for a while now, so this is a bit overdue. And you reached out just because you guys are pretty heavily focused on investing in B2B e-commerce and B2B SaaS, and more in companies that are relevant to the things that we talk about in the podcast. So tell us a little bit about your background and PeakSpan and how that all relates to this podcast.
Absolutely. Super excited to be on the podcast. I appreciate you inviting me on, Isaiah and Timothy. Quick fun facts about me. I'm a huge Kobe Bryant fan. So episode 81 actually has some historical significance. So I'm pumped about that. Now that you know my favorite basketball player, I'm a partner at PeakSpan. I've been working with growth stage business software companies for about 8 years and touch about 20 of our companies here. Prior to PeakSpan, pretty straightforward progression, worked for an investment bank doing software M&A advisory for a few years. And before that, a tech startup for just about a year, very small early stage, got disrupted by Amazon, AWS, and then kind of moved into the finance world. The brief PeakSpan upshot, just so everyone has it, we're about 6 years in, 1.5 billion AUM. Our latest fund was about 585, and consider us like a growth equity firm, sits in between venture and private equity for those not familiar. We're not investing in startups that just have an idea and a PowerPoint, and we're not buying companies taking control. We're looking for very exciting sectors and entrepreneurs that are kind of attacking a big vision, have some revenues, customers that are looking for capital to help them grow and make new hires and invest ahead of demand. That's the kind of genesis of the growth equity space. We back companies that are doing between 2 and 10 million in annual revenues. And more specifically, we're hyper focused on B2B software. It's all we've ever done across 85 partnerships. And within B2B software, the way we kind of bifurcate our firm is through what we call blueprint themes. So each investment professional only focuses on about 3 to 4 themes. And that just drives a lot of the leverage and focus in our model. And it's why we find ourselves on podcasts such as the B2B e-commerce podcast. So my themes are supply chain, procurement, e-commerce, and payments. And as we'll get into,
kind of all the things that are pretty much relevant to B2B e-commerce.
Exactly.
I mean, that pretty much is B2B e-commerce, right? Without the supply chain, you can't really sell anything. So
that's exactly right. So I'll pause there, Isaiah. Happy to fill in any blanks or go into other areas of my background, but that's me and PeakSpan.
Well,
yeah.
I want to just circle in on one thing before I throw it back to you, Isaiah. One thing you said, you said 85 companies, which is actually more than I realized you'd already, funded, or developed or worked with. So, can you name a few of those companies that people would know of our listeners, that would really be familiar with?
Yeah, happy to. So,
just a few.
Yeah, I'll just stick with e-commerce. We backed a e-commerce platform called Equid. They serve micro small business merchants, acquired by Lightspeed last year. Sounds like you're familiar. 2, we partnered with a company called Group 5 years ago that does enterprise site search for very large retailers, both B2B and B2C. So they pretty much power that search bar, and all the data and indexing behind that is very complex. 3, a company called Stylytics. They focus specifically on the fashion and apparel vertical, doing
shop client using them. Actually, it's like when
I know them.
We're implementing a project, so it's one of the tickets in Jira, implement Stylytics. Like, I think they already.
You did okay. You did okay. These are companies I actually know, so it's good. Good job.
That is good. And then lastly, sales layer, product information management across B2B and B2C, Valencia-based, moving into the UK and the US. More recent investment for us. This was about 4 months ago.
No, thank you for that. And sorry, Isaiah, I just want to make sure we got a sense of some of those investments.
Yeah. So at what point did you kind of realize, like, hey, these are all this is all getting more and more relevant to like B2B e-commerce versus like kind of the traditional, fashion is a good example of like fashion B2C is pretty mature, right? Like it's probably arguably like the most mature e-commerce. I think like some huge percentage of fashion is like e-commerce now relative to other verticals. So yeah, I guess what kind of made, where was like, I assume it wasn't necessarily initially the first, you said it's been 6 years at Peak. It wasn't like year 1, was there, or maybe it was like, when did you guys kind of realize that this was like an important part of this whole thesis, I guess?
if you bear with me, there's three areas that come to mind right off the bat. So area one is through e-commerce investments who do both B2C and B2B. Group by, for example, many of their clients at first were B2C, very recognizable brands, but as we got into that business and started working with them, we saw how amazing the B2B side was and the levels of spend and how strategic it is and how untapped it is. So through our existing investment, that's one area. Two is we do a ton of research because we only focus on a few themes. We have our own tech assets that we've built for the last 10 years that will allow us to track what trends are happening in e-commerce. So what keywords, like whenever B2B e-commerce is mentioned on the web, I get an email about it and we're looking at that.
And that's gone up. is that? I assume the keyword is going up. Yeah,
it's exactly right. We're looking at shoppable digital content or B2B e-commerce to influence where we're hunting. And then lastly, we have other investments in B2B. I guess just B2B more broadly, where we talk to those customers and prospects, and they tell us how important digitizing their sales are. So XOI and Dispatch, they both kind of serve like plumbing, roofing, HVAC, and we talk to those big OEM customers and they're all over e-commerce and they have tons of spend and it's all being very manually orchestrated today. They're all scratching their heads thinking about, man, how do we get all our stuff online? How do we automate this? How do we digitize our commerce? We need to be on top of that. And that's like a now conversation that's happening. So we follow those types of data points.
Why do you think they haven't done it? I mean, it seems like there's this big like spectrum that we're seeing. Like sometimes there's people that are pretty far along and they're pretty mature, and then you have people who have like zero, literally zero. And they could be like a pretty large company and it's all manual, send an invoice, it has to go to like NetSuite or, you know what I mean? Like it's a very not self-serve process. So I guess why do you think it's so early still?
Two reasons come to my mind. One is I always try to think about when these technologies were born, and not only when they were born, but when they've gotten to like a maturity point that makes them easy to understand and adopt and implement. And ecosystem constituents such as yourselves are critical to this adoption. Investors are critical. New software vendors that are attacking the problem are critical. There was B2B e-commerce companies available to big distributors and manufacturers 5 years ago, but they weren't well known. It wasn't great software necessarily.
There's no podcast.
There's no podcast. Exactly. And then second, the thing I always think about is it takes a pretty forward-leaning organization, one that is on solid footing, well capitalized, investing in IT, and then an executive that is sticking their neck out in the line and saying, we might do all of our sales in B2B manually for the last 20 years, but guess what? We can't do that. Like I'm telling you, I'm putting my career on the line. We have to adopt this now. It's going to be a 5-year journey, but I'm going to spearhead it and we're going to buy this technology and we're going to be 70% digital sales in the next 3 years. That person, I know a couple of them. I don't know a lot of them. And they're key to driving digital transformation.
So you think there's just a lot of people don't want to stick their neck out, take that risk, maybe get, blamed for the failure if it doesn't work. And then the tech is still kind of new in the sense that, in terms of mass market, there hasn't been a ton of like B2B e-commerce. There's no like Shopify. I mean, actually Shopify just launched, I think it's really worth noting this on this episode. They just launched updates to the B2B edition. You can now log into Shopify Plus. I did accept, it was like, I almost didn't believe it. And there's company accounts and price lists. So you can log into Shopify now and it's Shopify Plus, you have to pay, which most of the merchants at this stage, Plus is not crazy fees compared to, you know, it's a reasonably low price software in the grand scheme of things. We're talking enterprise software. So yeah, I mean, that's like a pretty massive change. They didn't have companies or priceless. You know?
Well, you know, one of the things you said, Jack, that's kind of interesting is like putting their career on the line, you know, to kind of get this stuff done. And it really is interesting that I think has been the case for a long time, but also what's happened, because I've been internal agency side and now consulting and all this sort of stuff, is that now I'm sometimes called in, right? I mean, I said, and our listeners have heard this before. It's like, well, you do it for us, right? You do it because then it softens the blow, right?
No one wants to get, they can like kind of blame you as the external factor. If it,
yeah, that's exactly what happens. I produce this, you know, elaborate evaluation that says what they already really know, but it has to be produced by somebody else. And I say, well, that's my expertise. You know,
it's like, oh, well, he runs the podcast, so now we have to do it. It's like, all right.
It is like that though.
Even though there's a guy internally who's probably been saying it for like 2 years, right? It's like
it's really the case. It's really the case. And you know, whatever gets it done at the end of the day is the important.
It's funny you said that, because we had a guy that reached out. He saw us on the podcast and he was like, oh, we want to consider BigCommerce. I think made sense because they had zero. It's kind of a lower cost, simpler option for starting from scratch and pretty good on the B2B side relative to most options. And they just like didn't do it. I forget, I don't know if it was money or they just like, it's like, oh, we're not ready. And then they reached out more recently and now they're like starting to seriously move into it. So it's just like a good example where like they've been thinking about it for a long time. And now they're like sort of starting, but they still haven't actually done it. They still haven't actually like signed off on the project. So, you know, how long you see how like, and even that, we're talking like a relatively small project in the grand scheme of things. Like,
give me a call if they're listening right now. Give me a call.
Yeah, it's just kind of, yeah. I think you're right. It's like, it's just, but at what point is becoming so? It's like the Mark Zuckerberg thing. The like biggest risk you could take is not taking a risk, or I think isn't that what he said? Something like that, where it's like you kind of have to take in this changing environment. It's like, by just doing nothing, like that is a bigger risk, in my opinion, than taking a little risk and trying out some of these new tech things, you know?
I think it's true always. I mean, that's again something that it's not peculiar to e-commerce or B2C, B2B or B2C e-commerce. It's not peculiar to any of those things, but it seems like things have accelerated to such a point, especially for B2B e-commerce right now, that if you don't take a risk, you will be gone. You know, the greater risk is not taking a risk. And I'm completely a believer in that. And I think a lot of our listeners at this point are believers in that too. You know, you have a great business. You have something going on that's your special thing in B2B. You've got to not just protect it, you've got to advance it, right? I mean, that's sort of the difference there. You can't just protect. You can't just put a boundary around it and say this is what it is, because people will come up faster around the side and then all of a sudden they're ahead of you.
Yeah.
I could throw another couple examples at you in procurement, where I probably have a bit closer of a lens, and you all probably a bit closer on the e-com, like pure play side. One dynamic is that the CPO, the Chief Procurement Officer, has like an average tenure of 18 months. So when you're using Ariba and you want to make some big changes to Ariba, maybe pull it out, maybe adopt a couple of best in breed vendors, you get to the job, you get your feet under you, you don't want to rattle any feathers, and you start to make progress on stuff. Even if you kick off that process to move to Coupa, for example, you might not be there to see it through. The next guy might have to inherit that, and that is never a good or comfortable situation. So we see that all the time. Where,
why are they leaving so fast? Are they getting fired or are they quitting?
I think it's a combo. I mean, supply chain world and procurement world, things are intense, and also there's just a lot of jumping around. I think people actually get in, realize how broken things are, and don't want to spend the next 10 years of their career like digging someone out of that. There are good examples, to your point though. There are like I was going to mention, I got off the call right before this with one of my procurement advisors, Nico Bach, who's the CPO at Procter & Gamble. They had a best-in-class procurement organization, best-in-class technology.
Well, yeah.
And then he left and became a consultant and is trying to help others pull that trigger and make those moves as well. So there's some good examples, but a lot in the procurement, and especially like manufacturing and distributors, old school mentality, no kind of one forward leading leader that's been there for 5 to 10 years. I think those are some of the fundamental building blocks that make companies successful.
So can we dig into procurement and the supply chain a little bit more? Because I actually think it's really critical. I think payments is getting pretty advanced. I think I don't know if you're familiar with Balance as a sponsor. Like you have these new like B2B payment options, and I think payments is going to get to the point where it's not much of a barrier for B2B e-commerce. But I still think supply chain and procurement is somewhat of a barrier, right? Because you have all these systems, legacy systems. It's also hard to change the way that buyers buy, right? Like you don't necessarily want to force people to do e-commerce if you're a man, just because you're digitizing, you want to be like, hey, people that call in, you could force them, but there's some risk there, right? So I guess, can we talk about that a little bit? Like the procurement supply chain side, they're kind of connected in my mind. Like that, do you think that's also part of the problem with why things are moving slower than maybe they should do e-commerce, just because people don't want to change it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I don't know if this is overstating it, you might have a better perspective, but 80-20 e-procurement and B2B e-commerce feel like the same thing a lot of the times.
They're very similar, right? You're really just trying to like automate the sales process to some degree, right? Or make it easier, right?
Exactly. Maybe building it from the ground up, like it comes down to digitizing your catalog, your inventory, your products, and making it available to, if you're a supplier, making it available to whether you're a retail buyer or whoever. Having that digital infrastructure in place is like one of the key things that I see is not there. Like I think around 50% of sales are still like the old school field sales, like via phone call. Here's our catalog. Here's what I want to order. Here are the part numbers. Let's do it that way. And I think just recently we crossed over that 50% threshold is digital. To make it 100% digital, the one I think key difference between B2B and B2C is not all B2B inventory is perfectly digitized and in an inventory system and using a product information management system. That's one, I think, thing that's holding us back is having that all digital and then connected to the proper channels so that buyers can easily access it, view it, and have that, B2C like e-commerce experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. I think what's interesting to me is, let's say it keeps going, it's definitely going to shift to more digital, but like, I think a lot of people are still focused in some ways too heavily on like the e-procurement, EDI, purchasing. And the problem I think that they're going to face with that is that's good if you're like, oh, I just want to punch in and buy, XYZ SKUs and you're the procurement person and just really simple, but you're not really getting any merchandising value, right? So like, if they're not logging into an e-commerce platform and like going through the experience and seeing your products, if you're a manufacturer, you want them to be seeing the brand and new things about the brand, and that's where e-commerce can help you with that. And if you're a distributor, you probably have a large catalog, which most do. So them just going and punching in like 5 SKU numbers in their e-procurement, it's like, you're not really merchandising anything. You know what I mean? Like you're really like selling yourself short, in my opinion. And I just don't see how that's not a very like competitive advantage growth strategy in my mind,
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that I would add too, and I think that it's funny because even though we're specifically about B2B e-commerce, right? At least that's what we always, center our conversations on. a lot of the conversations with, clients, people I'm talking to are now the broader discussions about digitization and automation and, everything that's left behind in a process. It's like, how are all the ways you're servicing your customers? Are people still forced to do things that they don't want to be doing? Can they contact you, through a live chat? All of these kinds of things that are really just kind of wide open for a lot of people in B2B. So e-procurement is a critical piece of this, and EDI and all these other pieces. But it's fascinating. It's like you've got to just roadmap out every single process, and you've got to say, all right, where are we, right? Like, where are we in each one of these things? And is it to the level of satisfaction? It needs to be for every type of customer or client that we have. And, when you get deep into this, unfortunately, I'm doing like a 16-page questionnaire for one client going out to their top customers, right? Mm-hmm. The answers that are coming back from that, because I see them, they're anonymized so that the company doesn't see which clients are saying what. They're not too good. They're basically saying like, oh my God, here's a list of the 12 things that you still don't do that I want you to do, right? So that's, I think, where we are with a lot of these, processes now. And that's really what, you're a money guy, Jack, sorry, you're a money guy, Jack. And so basically we've got to think about like, well, where's the money going to flow to address all these things in order to get more revenue to flow into these businesses, right? Where's the priority?
Absolutely. You raised a number of really great points there, and to bring it back to the e-procurement point,
yep.
One area that I focus heavily on is, we can call it supplier digitization, or like supplier payments, or supplier connectivity. So in the e-procurement mindset, you're a big manufacturer and you have 10,000 suppliers, and you need to buy parts from all those suppliers on an ongoing basis. Maybe you have an e-procurement platform where you ingest or onboard those suppliers, which is a whole category of itself, right? Supplier data management, mm-hmm. onboarding suppliers, connecting to suppliers. There's companies like Shiphawk that build marketplaces for their clients that allow them to connect to all of their sugar suppliers to make their Coca-Cola, if that's one of their clients. But then on the other side of the coin, this is like where you bridge, I think, B2B, e-commerce, and procurement. Each of those suppliers has to then connect digitally to the Trellis kind of instance, and they might have to do that for Coca-Cola for one client in that setting. But then, to Isaiah's point, like, that's not really solving anything. That's not really doing much. You're adhering to your one client's way to do digital B2B sales, but you don't have your own platform, and you don't have any merchandising value. You don't have any scalability to do that.
You're basically a commodity at that point. Like, at what point do they just say, oh, it cost me $11 to buy your sugar because I'm just looking at this like green. I know I'm making it simple, but these Coupa platforms, they're not going to like give you any nurturing value. So if they're just buying it through that, it's like, yeah, I just bought 12 pounds of sugar. Oh, this other guy provides it for $10 less, like you don't even see the packaging and the brand value in doing that. And you're just like, well, I'm gonna get it somewhere else. Like, what I mean? I just feel like the vulnerability of having your customers purchase that way is very high, in that they're not going to see a lot of value and reason to stick with you.
This is one of my big bets on the B2B software side, and as it pertains to anyone selling stuff online, whether we're B2B or B2C. I think about it in terms of like marketplaces like Amazon is like an example everyone understands. It's super dangerous to sell on all these platforms without owning the brand relationship and owning your product content and being able to have that updated in multiple spots and have the direct relationship with the customer, show that you're a real valuable relationship and brand, and you have a great product. If you're not investing in those areas to increase your long-term brand value. To your point, Isaiah, you're going to be a commodity. You're going to sell through marketplaces. You're not going to have any face with the customer. It's not going to end well for a lot of brands that don't invest in the core infrastructure to sell direct. And that can be D2C, or that it could be direct to your other like B2B relationship.
What do you think about this concept that I'm thinking a lot about, which is if you can build your e-commerce infrastructure good enough and be in a B2B capacity, and then I think TradeCentric, one of our partners that formerly Punch Out to Go, and I'm sure there's others, but can do this where then you can connect to your clients' e-procurement so they could still use your website. You kind of culturally train them to use the website for hopefully whatever value that, you know, the merchandising value, maybe it's the payments value so they can see their open invoices and pay out. Like it can be a valuable portal for them to do things in a way beyond what just Coupa might do. And then the data can flow back to their Coupa or, so you're kind of training them to use e-commerce, get the brand value, get the marketing, you get their data, you can flow it into your CRM and those other systems, whatever you want to do with it, but you can still send it back to the systems they need. Because I think that's part of it, right? Like they don't want to have to like go back and then enter, like the example you gave, if they have 10,000 suppliers, I don't want to have to go order on an e-commerce site and then like manually go enter it into Coupa, because that's just like, there's no way.
Yeah,
A lot of time to do that, right? So that part does, I think, need to be somewhat automated, or they probably won't use the website, you know?
Yeah, it's super interesting. I've talked to companies over the years attacking the same problem in different ways. I think that's going to be a necessity if we're talking like large enterprise buyer.
Yeah,
uses a e-procurement platform.
you have to integrate with it. Like basically anyone over $1 billion, $1 billion, I feel like if you don't integrate with their Coupa or whatever it is, it's almost gonna be impossible to be their supplier, you know?
Yeah, so there's a couple companies that that do this, even down market. Company called Order, used to be Negotiatis. They did this for smaller people where you had like a Chrome plugin and you can buy stuff online, but it all gets added to the same cart. You can do like a single invoice across multiple vendors. Client gets all loops back into your core spend management system. There's then a company called Acquire that was acquired by Coupa that did something similar, where it was like a punch in type of technology, where they like you could buy from that same website experience, but have it be pulled back in. And then I don't know if this falls in the same camp, but a company called Zip.hq does procurement approvals. So I think where the world is moving is being able to do your buying in that consumer-like experience, like when you go home and shop on Amazon. Be able to go on the website, add it to cart, but again, to both of your points, have it be pulled back into the right system and be compliant and be approved by the right people. But for the purchaser, I think long term, it's not going to be sustainable to ask someone who was born after 1990 to go log into a portal and not see the products in their native form and purchase that way. I think we're going to move away from that and more towards this out in the wild, but with approval systems, with compliance, with integrations back into the ERP or procure-to-pay system.
Do you think that, especially the younger generation, is going to want to go to the website, almost like, because it'll probably be a more immersive experience, right? You have AR. I have a friend. I did a small investment in an AR company for e-commerce, right? Like I think that's getting lower cost, where you can kind of digitize, 3D model your products out. So I think to your point, people want that. They want to like really know what they're buying and not just see like, oh, it's a 1-inch piece of PVC pipe. Like, I don't know, you know what I mean? Like just like a couple like little text fields is like not enough. Is that kind of where you're seeing this going, right?
100%. The consumer or the buyer, the employee, they're demanding it over time. They're gonna speak with their usage and their dollars, and then vendors are gonna see the usage and the purchasing dollars, and then we're gonna see which vendors are doing it the right way, and we're going to back those vendors, and over time
yeah, it's like, I mean, it's like,
Just another thing connected to this too is things like training animations. I mean, this is something, so this is fascinating. I had this conversation with somebody really, and they sell parts, right? And the idea is that people are saying, well, I don't want the manual anymore. I don't want to download a PDF of a freaking manual to tell me how to do X, Y, and Z. Where's your YouTube video, right? But a lot of these businesses don't have that. So they're actually working on doing animated videos of the parts manuals and the service manuals, trying to say like, here, move this plug into this plug and do this and this. And I think it's like already overdue. It really is exactly what has to happen, because again, consumers are demanding this. And it's not just people, born, since 1992. I mean, I was born before 1992, and believe me, I love that, right? I want that kind of stuff now. I want it right this minute,
Yeah, and I think to your point, they're gonna demand almost like a full buying experience around the problem, right? Like, I need to buy supplies to make my product, like almost like, here's the whole problem, like present me all the things that go into that solution, right? Not just like one little piece of it. You know what I mean? So let's say like a house, right? Like I need all the things that go into the parts that I need for this house. Or I don't know. Yeah, I'm using that as
there's
renovation.
I'll give you a scenario, Isaiah. This one came up also with a conversation I had recently. A company that does security systems installations for private homes and for like small condo complexes and whatever. Well, they want to be able to show what it entails, like to the buyers, right? So it's like, I'm going to put these 16 cameras all over the place and sensors in these windows and whatever. They need visualization software for that, but they want to depend on the manufacturers to actually have it. Like, why should they be producing it for the manufacturer in a sense, is what they're saying. It's like, you're making this stuff here, figure it out and come back to me so I can sell more of them for you. Right. And it really is a completely valid question. Like, how do you get that done? It's a B2B commerce question, right? I mean, it's absolutely the case. I want to go into a site and order the system and then see how it would be done and how it would be installed, and then give that to my installer, maybe,
Yeah, it's kind of like the virtual version of like Home Depot, where like you go in and they already like try and do it in person, right? Like they present you like the kitchen section of like examples of like half a kitchen, you know what I mean? Like you see, it's not like you just see that one piece, you see it all fitting together. And I think that's what people are going to want to see online. Like, they don't want to just see the like faucet piece by itself, because it's like, well, does it really fit? I don't know if it like fits. Does it look good on the, it's like you want to see it all like come together to some degree, right? And
yeah, I mean, there's an educational software company I've been talking to that's trying to do a lot of these things for B2B, but again, there are a lot of gaps, and I think it's really something that B2B manufacturers and distributors and suppliers, all these pieces, right, and all the service people also just need to kind of jump into the game, because it's all going to benefit them. I mean, one of the clients I'm working with now, it's going to benefit them if they do more things like this, and they just got to get there.
I'll give you two examples, unbiased, but they're in our portfolio. Stylytics, Isaiah, as you know, because you know them, they do what you're describing. They started in fashion and apparel, but we're moving into like home decor, and then anything with objects can be the same thing, which is essentially bundling, outfitting, packaging. Let's see the chair with the end table with the light, and sell it as a bundle, like the Home Depot in-person experience, but online. And anecdotally, brands and retailers see massive uplift from showing outfits, showing bundles, because people want that experience and they want to be shown what would it look like if I wore the blouse with, the shorts and
Yeah, because most things aren't one thing. It's a thing that goes with all the things, right?
Mhm.
Especially in B2B, right? So, yeah.
And on the B2B side, our company XOI, they ingest a ton of data on all these assets out in the field, these HVAC units, these parts, and they have techs out there fixing them, and they're collecting all this data. And what you might find interesting is the OEMs, as I mentioned, are trying to sell more and more online, but they're also just struggling with the after they release like a year's worth of AC units, what parts are compatible with those to fix them over time. Where's the product information associated with those units, like the whole digital kind of information associated with that. They need to something Isaiah was speaking about earlier. They need to step it up. They need to own that customer journey. They need to own every piece of information about these very expensive units out in the field. And that involves communicating with the techs, the people who implement them, the distributors. All of that is not digitized. It's a huge opportunity in this space.
Well, let me ask you a different question, because I think this is becoming more and more relevant and a little bit of a concern to me, because I hope we don't live in a world where it's like there's only 3 companies that just do everything, right? And sometimes it feels like we're moving more towards that, right? With the way the economy is going in some ways. But what do you think the trend and the danger, but also benefit? I think there's a lot of benefit, but just like anything, there's good and bad of like the verticalization of all this stuff, right? So I think one of the best examples is Tesla, right? Like they're pretty vertically integrated, right? Like I think they're pretty much making the batteries. Like I know obviously they don't make every nut and bolt, but like, they're bringing the suppliers together, but they're even manufacturing a lot of the pieces themselves. Like they're really vertically integrated. And then they've cut out all the distributors, right? So there's no dealerships. There's not even really any authorized reseller / service providers, really. So they've really cut out the middleman. Apple is probably another good example. And I don't think it's a coincidence that these are 2 of like some of the most successful, fastest growing, most profitable, largest companies in the world, right? Like, I don't think we can say, oh, well, that just happens to be that they're both vertically integrated. Same thing. I mean, even Amazon to some degree is like private label, like they're getting more. They just bought iRobot. I mean, at what point do they continue to manufacture more and more of the robots and also sell the robot directly? You know what I mean? It's just, where do you see that going, and how do you see that like impacting this B2B space, especially for the middleman, like distributors? I think they're vulnerable in that they could get cut out of that vertical integration, right?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I've never thought of that. I can share at some recent supply chain conferences, we brought this up, just talking about this concept of deglobalization. So amidst like trade wars and real war, hot wars, sourcing more locally and not being dependent on international freight is a huge topic. So
expensive, right? Like at some point you're like, well, if I can get it here, it's more expensive. But if you take out the freight cost, it like, or the whatever the container cost, it might actually be cheaper,
Exactly. And then I will draw a dichotomy with, so I love the vertically integrated strategy in payments land. We're seeing it all the time, all the time, right? Apple, like every company, I can give you 5 headlines a day of a company that does, logistics and also is now offering banking or sells, Apple buy now, pay later. If you're a big enough company, you should be doing all of your payments and financial services.
You might as well, right? It's like, all right, why would I give that money to Stripe when or whatever? Like, I can like kind of basically take some of that money, right? Like basically.
And then here's the difference for me in supply chain. For big companies like Tesla and Amazon, absolutely. But I struggle to find examples, that probably because I'm just not looking, of smaller companies that are able to do that because it's harder. It's not partnering
it's
with big.
very hard.
Yeah,
But
you can't do that as a small business. I don't
Couldn't you
think.
start to do it incrementally though? Like, okay, I'm not saying all or nothing, right? Like we have to completely be vertically integrated, but I don't know, we have this one supply. All right, we're gonna, maybe it's the biggest component or cost. We're gonna start making that, or we're gonna locally source it, or you see what I'm getting? We're gonna 3D print it, like especially with 3D printing and AI and all these, like I just see some of these things becoming a lower barrier to entry than they maybe were, you know, in the past. And so I definitely agree. It's unlikely, you know, a little $10 million business is going to be fully vertically integrated, making some, you know, refrigerator from the ground.
I mean, I do know of companies that have bought like their own factories and stuff. I mean, these sorts of things are great, but you do have to get to a certain size. You know, you're right. You have to get to a certain place in your development before you really can do it. And I also think it probably doesn't work for everything. I'm not even sure why I'm saying that in a sense, but I'm not sure how it could work for everything. You know, maybe
well,
I'm just.
Let me rephrase it though, because basically the more middleman, the more margin you're taking out. But I think there's a problem with that, right? Like we've seen where some of these D2C businesses have tried to go pure D2C, and it's just so expensive to acquire the customers. And you know, to your point, they've ended up, and I think it is the right strategy for like I don't know, some like mid-market, small D2C business to go, all right, I'm going to sell on Amazon. I'm going to sell on Walmart. Like I can't get to all of America and whatever, Europe on my own. But at the same time, if you're like a mid-market manufacturer distributor, at what point do you realize like, hey, you know, we have so much middlemen in our process. Let's start going to direct to consumer in this part. Like, at what point do you just start to cut out some of the pieces, you know, it just seems like that's almost like a no-brainer for some of these companies. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'll give you 2 examples. This isn't so much about like manufacturing your own components. I just don't have visibility in there because we do software, but in terms of logistics, on one hand, we have a company called Dispatch. They do last mile delivery for the B2B industrial supply chain. So same like manufacturers that I was talking about with XOI, they see an interesting thing happening where like fleets for like a big like paint company, for example, they have big fleets that they invested in over the years, but they're actually reducing that CapEx, reducing those assets, and using, this is like the Uber for part running for industrial supply. They're going with the flexible Uber model. On the Shiphawk side, they win if D2C brands, they do some B2B, but D2C brands have their own warehouses. But they see these brands jump back and forth like over the years between 3PL and 3PL is too expensive, too much margin. Let me take this in house and have my own warehouse. They see a little bit of like indecision over the years on the exact point that you're raising, Isaiah, is like, can I get better margins if I have a warehouse, or is it too difficult because I can't do it, I'm too small? Do I need to do it in 3PL?
Yeah, you definitely have to be at a certain scale, right? Like, I mean, we have a PEO system, right? Are you familiar with like the PEO concept, right? Like, we're just not big enough, but maybe eventually I think I've heard from people, like you get to a certain scale, you hire a CFO, you get the right kind of people where it's like, all right, well, we can just kind of do this in-house and negotiate our own benefits cheaper than the PEO can, right? Like, it's kind of that concept. And I think if you do it strategically, there's a lot of opportunity, especially in the mid-market, maybe smaller enterprise, to like basically cut out middlemen and little pieces. I think the problem is people try and do it, they see it as a black and white, all or nothing, when it's like, okay, let's use a warehouse example. I ship, let's just say I'm just the US, right? Because it's easier. And my customers are mostly around the country, but maybe 40% of my customers are in California and Oregon, like West Coast or whatever. Okay, maybe it makes sense for me to build my own warehouse just there. And that I can really get good and get low cost because I don't have to pay a middleman. But then I use a 3PL for the rest because I'm not going to build a warehouse in Chicago, in
That's
Texas,
a good example.
in New York City. Like that's what I think that's missing. And going way back to your point from like the first 5 minutes, 10 minutes, it's like it almost feels like there's just not any strategic leader guiding this kind of stuff. It's like they're either kind of stuck in the old ways or they're trying to like move forward, and there's no one kind of like saying, well, hey, like we could do a little bit of both. We don't have to like completely blow up everying we're doing. We could do.
Well, I'm gonna suggest something and see what Jack says about this, because I think part of the problem is that, you know, a CMO role or a COO role or a CFO role are more clearly defined historically. But now a lot of the things that we're talking about, well, is it CTO? Is it the new idea?
You just nailed it on the head. Basically, the problem that I'm seeing is that, is it the CTO? Is it the CMO? It's sort of the CEO, but then a lot of times CEOs are way in over their head and they're not qualified to handle any of this stuff, but they've got the resume, so no one's going to fire them, or they're the owner, like whatever it is, you know? And so it's kind of a mix of a CTO, CMO, I would say COO, like logistics, supply chain, like an operational background, right? You have this like mixed executive skill set. And usually one of those individuals is too siloed or just too scared to bridge the gap into the other ways. It just doesn't really happen. But I think to your point, that's exactly the problem, Tim. Or they just, a lot of times they have a CMO but no CTO, or they have a CTO but no CMO, or it's like there's just this gap there and it just never really gets filled. And so the strategic thinking is just not really there, you know?
Yeah, what do you think, Jack?
I completely agree. I was thinking, like COO or head of supply chain, but that also touches, depending on what you're talking about, it touches so many other facets. Like in some of your examples, and we're talking about like buying real estate, buying a warehouse, or renting out a warehouse. That's a pretty big decision, and it goes into the CEO and C-suite. It's always a combination of people in the organization. And then I also would throw in balancing the now versus the future. It's just such a difficult thing in supply chain. I've had a thesis over the last 24 months that, the types of software platforms that we're investing in that we think will do well are those that can solve pain quickly. If we're talking about like deglobalization or like taking something in-house or putting a whole new like IT system in place, or your first B2B e-commerce platform, if your supply chain is effed, you're trying to solve that and you're not necessarily willing to go and adopt and do a big digital transformation initiative. So I think it's a combination of multiple constituents, no one stepping up and putting their career on the line, a lot going on in supply chain to just fix and not fail, not look like an idiot out there.
Yeah. It's like no one got fired for choosing IBM. And I feel like that's a lot of what's going on.
Yep.
And then, but the problem is, I just posted on LinkedIn, I'm sure I'll get some, I like to kind of stir the pot a little bit. I don't know if you saw the recent Gartner report, but it had, the e-commerce had SAP, Salesforce, Adobe, Magento, and Commerce Tools as the leaders. In my opinion, SAP is the most risky choice on that entire chart, because you're buying this expensive software. Not many vendors do it. Like, we don't do it. I don't know anyone in the space. It's like, oh, we're going to like move into the SAP e-commerce services space. Like it's just not a common thing so it's like the community is clearly dying. It's not growing, but they're listed as a leader, and someone will not get fired for choosing SAP e-commerce. But in my opinion, in theory, you're choosing the riskiest thing, because I don't know if you saw what happened with Oracle Commerce. They just discontinued the whole thing. The entire Oracle commerce platform is discontinued. And they were a leader on that thing like 3 years ago or 4, like not that long ago. So the point I'm making is like, people are making the safe choice, but by making the safe choice, they're actually making the most risky choice.
People spent multi-million-dollar, budgets on Oracle. I mean, that's something that we had talked about in a previous episode too. Those were, you're right, probably less than 3 years ago, saying, look, it's in the Gartner, quadrant, and it's okay. And then here's what happened.
I'm gonna see if I can pull it up. Let's try Magic
Quadrant, digital commerce, they call it.
Digital commerce.
Yeah, they don't call it e-commerce.
2019. Let's just see what pops up.
It's fun, right? This is live, people. We're doing something live.
Oh my God, look at this. Look at this. 2019.
I can't wait. I'm ready.
Can you guys, it's kind of small.
We see everything here.
You can see it on a, can you guys see that?
Yep. SAP,
Oracle,
Adobe,
right
Oracle, and Salesforce.
So, like I said, Adobe and Salesforce are still on the list. I think they will be for a while. Oracle is now gone. Like, they don't even exist in the digital commerce space. And I think SAP is next. So I think that this is very misleading for a lot of reasons, but anyways, my point is, I think people think that they're making the safe choice, and they're not. So
Exactly. Well, Jack, we're getting close to the end of our time for the podcast. We should make sure that people know again how to reach you, or how, if you want to be reached. Like, maybe I should say that.
No, I love this stuff. I'm a geek when it comes to e-commerce, supply chain, and payments. So please reach out. I can be reached on my LinkedIn. Jack Freeman, email address jack@peakspancapital.com. Very reachable, very responsive, and always happy to chat on this stuff.
Ask them for a couple $100 million bucks. They'll write you a check, and I'm just kidding.
Absolutely, it's that easy. It's that easy.
It'll take a couple hours. It's that easy. No, I'm just kidding.
Just fill out the form online.
I do want to ask you one last question though. What are you most, since you're so deep in this world, what are you most excited about, in the near term, not like 2040 and we're flying on spaceships kind of idea of payments, supply chain, B2B, whether it's something you're invested in or you're hopefully going to invest in coming up soon?
What am I most looking forward to?
Yeah, or just something cool that you see happening.
Yeah, well, I think who you mentioned one of your sponsors is in the B2B e-commerce payment space.
Yes, Balance.
Balance.
Yep, Balance. Yep.
Balance, yeah. I thought that company is super interesting, and I think represents just a really massive opportunity in B2B payments, B2B e-commerce. I always like to throw out the very large stats of, whether it's 120 or 200 trillion in B2B payments volume, and what the stakes are for digitizing and monetizing that. And a lot of that is going to come from having like a very coherent e-commerce and payment strategy in B2B. And with a lot of the stuff we talked about today, to be honest, but I'll stick with my answer. I am very excited by how little progress has been made relative to what I think could be. And that's why for the next 10, 20 years, we're very confident there'll be a lot of opportunities to invest, to grow the ecosystem together. I think we're in inning, pick 1, 2, or 3, and we have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 to go. And I'd say, to answer your question specifically, it's just seeing the tech ecosystem that supports B2B commerce and B2B payments.
I think what people don't realize is just like, we still get a lot of physical checks. Like, we have to, we're not always at the office. I might stop by just to pick up checks today, right? And our CTO probably comes in the most just because he lives the closest to the office and he's on vacation. It's like, we could try and force everyone to stop paying us in checks, but checks are still a huge section of B2B payments. It's like, I don't know what it is. Maybe you know the number. It's what? It's got to be like some huge percentage of B2B payments. Just physical checks, which to me also seems like the least secure thing in the world. It's like this thing that has your routing number on it that just could kind of like get lost in the mail. Like, I don't know. Just seems crazy, right? Like
terribly unsecure. There's so many risk and fraud challenges as well that we have talked about, but yeah, like e-commerce payment authentication, like there's so much in the payments world that that will get more adoption. It will decrease fraud risk. It will increase digitization, save people so much time and money. I'm very excited to see this space continue to digitize because it's there and people see it. We're talking about it, and there just needs to be more time and investment in the space.
Let me just add one more anecdote to this. Like, we don't have a secretary or anything. We did, but we're just pretty digitized, and it's easy to schedule our own meetings. We just don't have enough need for it at the moment. And so like we deposit our own checks, right? I mean, I guess even then, I'm not sure a secretary would do that for us because of the risk. But it's like just the time, like, the CEO or whatever, one of the owners of us has to like go and log in and like deposit these checks one by one on our phone. It's like, it sounds really simple, but like it's such a like small but like also kind of big distraction that could take up half an hour of time just by you got to go check the mail, you open it, figure it out, like, and you know how it is, the switching context, and you kind of like forget what you were doing and you have to go back. Like, it sounds so little, but it's like those things add up. And imagine we don't get a bajillion payments. I can only imagine some big company that gets, our payments are fairly large, so we don't get a ton of them at once. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so, spot on. It's the worst. The pain, I mean, I shouldn't say that. The pain is different in large enterprises, but the pain is felt deeply in SMB, and that's where a lot of actually new payments companies see the opportunity. Long tail SMBs in the US, not digitized, too costly, too time consuming, don't have a payments division to take care of that. So yeah. I totally hear you there.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to have you back. Maybe when you come back, you can kind of update us on your thesis and the progress that's been made.
I think our listeners would really appreciate it. We only got the tip of the iceberg here. It's great to have you, Jack. Jack Freeman, PeakSpan Capital. I want to make sure I get that right.
You got it right. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate you having me on the podcast.
It's a pleasure.